Hello, good evening, friends. How are you doing today? Hope that you are all doing well and that you are enjoying this very wonderful Sunday, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening. Over in the UK, we've just reached 9 o'clock in the evening, had a lovely day going to church and then going for a walk in the countryside. Lots of lovely country estates around here to explore. And I'm really looking forward to this stream, which I hadn't actually planned to do originally. It wasn't something that I had thought of and really developed over a series of weeks, like some of my other topics. Instead, what happened really is so in preparation for Wagner Day, which, if you don't know, on the 27th of May, we're going to have lots of contributions from a variety of people on YouTube, where we're going to be discussing the life and works of Richard Wagner. In preparation for that, I've been rewatching or watching some of the operas, and I finished Parsifal last night, which I must say is my favorite one so far. I really enjoyed it, and I think it's amazing. But I went to bed, and as I was lying in bed, suddenly all these ideas came into my mind about the relationship between Richard Wagner and J.R.R. Tolkien, how their works compare and contrast, the points of continuity and the differences. And one after another, a point kept arising in my mind. And it wasn't like I was thinking it through. They just were coming there. And one of the things that I've learned from Wagner, or one of the big things he spoke about, especially in the latter half of his career, is that he had a tendency to try and focus purely on what he had consciously worked out and put that into his operas. But he came to realize actually he should follow his intuitions, his unconscious promptings, and fully work them out. And in so doing, he was able to create even more beautiful music. And so, very much in that spirit, I just thought, well, let's strike while the iron is hot and do a stream exploring some of the ways in which the two authors or two figures relate to each other. It's not going to be entirely exhaustive because there's so many areas you could talk about. For example, uh, obviously Richard Wagner's primary output was opera. It was the setting of various stories, dramas, many taken from mythology and legend, such as Norse mythology, or the story of Tristan and Isolde, or the story surrounding the Holy Grail, and presenting them in a musical form. Well, and part of that was Wagner's belief that music, how to put it, in short, music gives us access to the essence of things. It goes beyond the world of appearances, the illusory forms, the visible forms of things, to what they are in themselves. And we kind of have this idea, right, in Tolkien, because in the very beginning of the world, what do we have first? We have song. Song, which underlies the very being of all things and indeed provides the template for the physical world. And then later, through the stories, we see various characters sing songs which have the power to change reality and to move, um, to change what otherwise would be unchanged. I'm thinking particularly of the story of Beren and Luthien. So Tolkien shares with Wagner an idea about how music maps onto the very fundamental character of reality. So that's just one example of the myriad ways in which we can relate these two. But I'm going to just focus on those few things which, as I say, arose up in my mind, prompted by my unconscious between the dream world and the waking world. And we'll see some of um, the interesting ways in which they intersect and diverge. Now, there's something worth saying at the very beginning of this about um, the what's been discussed about their relationship up to this point, because it has been the subject of scholarly attention within Tolkien studies, and indeed J.R.R. Tolkien famously commented upon this relationship. There seems to be, at least on a superficial level, an obvious comparison to make. Both Wagner and Tolkien uh, presented stories that dealt with the fantastical. I'm thinking particularly for Wagner of his Ring Cycle, and for Tolkien, you've got The Lord of the Rings. And within these, we find dwarves, giants, godlike beings, magic. We have a ring which seems to be connected with power, so on and so forth. Mighty heroes, and etc., etc. And so, in the Swedish translation of The Lord of the Rings, in its first original, the translator offered an introduction where he drew attention to this point. And I want to read you a letter Tolkien wrote to his publishers, Allen and Unwin, about this introduction. I want to read it in full because I think you will be able to see the context of Tolkien's comments about the ring cycle within this broader, very angry and thus humorous letter. So let me open up my book. This is from letter 229, dated 23rd of February 1961. This is Tolkien. I now enclose a copy and version of Ake Olmark's Nonsense, in the hope that you may think it justifies my annoyance. I have not looked at his second outburst. I feel I cannot just now take any more. Quoting Ake, or Olmark's. It is hard to believe that the deep-rooted native-born hobbit from Middle South England would feel very much at home in Leeds. Inauguration into the Anglo-Saxon chair in Oxford was for him like the coming home again from a trial expedition up to the distant Fornost. Tolkien. This is Olmark's first serious piece of presumptuous impertinence. I was devoted to the University of Leeds, which was very good to me, and to the students, whom I left with regret. The present students are among my most attentive readers, and write to me especially about the appendices. If Olmark's nonsense was to come the notice of the university, it would give offence, and Olmark would have to publicly apologise. As for Fornost, a glance at the book would show that it is comparable rather to the King's Mounds at Old Uppsala than to the city of Leeds. Olmark. One of his most important writings, published in 1953, also treats of another famous homecoming, the homecoming of Beorhtnoth, Beorhthelm's son. Tolkien. Coming home dead without a head, as Beorhtnoth did, is not very delightful. But this is spoof. Olmark knows nothing about Beorhtnoth or his homecoming, never mentioned till I wrote a poem about it, and he has not seen the poem. I do not blame him, except for writing as if he knew. Olmark. The professor began by telling tales about Middle-earth to his children, then to his grandchildren, and they were fascinated and clamoured for more and still more. One can clearly see before one the fireside evenings in the peaceful villa out at Sandfield Road in Headington near Oxford, with the Barrow Downs or Headington Hills in the rear and the misty mountains or the 560 feet high Shotover in the background. Tolkien. This is such outrageous nonsense that I should suspect mockery if I did not observe that Olmark is ever ready to assume intimate knowledge that he has not got. I have only 2 grandchildren, one 18 who first heard of the book 5 years ago. The other is only 2. The book was written before I moved to Headington, which has no hills, but is on a shoulder, as it were, of Shotover. Olmark. The ring is in a certain way der Nibelungen Ring, that is, the ring cycle. Tolkien. Both rings were round, and the resemblances end, or ceases. Olmark, which was originally forged by Volund the master smith, and then by way of Vitika and Vare passed through the hands of the mighty Aesir into the possession of Hreidmar and the dragon. After the dragon's fall, coming to Sigurd the Dragonslayer, after his murder by treacherous conspirators coming to the Burgundians, after their death in Atli's snake pit coming to the Huns, then to the sons of Jonakur, to the Gothic tyrants Ermanrica, etc. Tolkien. Thank heaven for the etc. I began to fear that it would turn up in my pocket. Evidently, Dr. Olmark thinks that it is in his. But what is the point of all this? Those who know something about the Old Norse side of the Nibelung traditions, mainly refer to since the name forms used are Norse, will think this is a farrago of nonsense. Those who do not will be hardly interested. But perhaps they are also meant to conclude that Dr. Olmark has master cap. It has nothing whatsoever to do with the Lord of the Rings. As for Wayland Smith being a pantype or being reflected both in Bombadil and in Gollum, this is sufficient example of the silly methods and nonsensical conclusions of Dr. Olmark. He is welcome to the rubbish, but I do not see that he, as a translator, has any right to unload it here. Olmark. In Mordor rules the personification of satanic might Sauron, read perhaps in the same partial fashion as other identifications Olmark has made, Stalin. Tolkien. There is no perhaps about it. I utterly repudiate any such reading, which angers me. The situation was conceived long before the Russian Revolution. Such allegory is entirely foreign to my thought. The placing of Mordor in the East was due to simple narrative and geographical necessity within my mythology. The original stronghold of evil was, as traditionally, in the north. But as that had been destroyed, and was indeed under the sea, there had to be a new stronghold, far removed from the Valar, the elves, and the sea power of Numenor. Olmark. There are reminiscences of journeys on foot in his own youth, up into the Welsh border regions. Tolkien. As Bilbo said of the dwarves, he seems to know as much of my private pantries as I do myself, or pretends to. I never walked in Wales or the marches in my youth. Why should I be made an object of fiction while still alive? So you can see that Tolkien was deeply angered by this Swedish translator's introduction. He took exception to multiple aspects of it, thought that it misrepresented his biography, that it misstated things about what was in The Lord of the Rings itself. And this is the context in which he made his famous claim, and I'll repeat it here, that the only similarity with Wagner's ring cycle is that in both rings were round, and there the resemblance ceases. And that was all that Tolkien ever said on the matter, at least in print. But a lot of scholarship has come to, Tolkien scholarship has come to question this rather extreme comment. Tom Shippey, who is perhaps the Tolkien scholar par excellence, has pointed out that there are a number of similarities in plot devices between the Ring Cycle and the Lord of the Rings. And although these are both borrowed from the original sources, such as the Nibelungid and the Volsunga saga, there seems to be Tolkien's awareness of the Ring Cycle, he attended it many times, suggests that it's not as clear-cut as there was only 2 rings in it. There's probably more being taken across here. Others, like Jamie McGregor, have done a very good job of showing this in quite a lot of detail, the comparisons, and we'll get to some of them in due course. At the same time, though, we can also see why Tolkien may have been hostile to Wagner, beyond just being hostile to that Swedish translator. As the Second World War progressed, Tolkien became increasingly antagonistic towards Hitler and the Nazis, who he believed had distorted Scandinavian and German mythology. And he saw his own project as trying to correct a lot of the mistakes that had been made by the National Socialists in Germany. Given Wagner's own association with the National Socialists, and I don't mean the man Wagner was a National Socialist, let's get that clear. He died a long time before the rise of the Nazis. Rather, the Nazis celebrated the operas of Richard Wagner and indeed, in their own way, interpreted them, especially the Ring Cycle, as affirming a robust German nationalism, a militaristic German nationalism. And so Tolkien may, as a kind of extension of his hostility to the Nazis, have been also hostile to Wagner, who Shippey suggests Tolkien thought had made mistakes about Norse mythology too, and that he was trying to correct them. We may also see that although both use Norse mythology, Scandinavian mythology, and engage with the primary sources, indeed Wagner, as we'll see in Wagner Day, was very attentive to the original sources and to the cutting-edge scholarship on them in his own time period. Both men had seemingly very different views about the world. Bradley Berzer puts it like this: Wagner was a 19th century German socialist, a believer in the apotheosis of man. Tolkien was a 20th century English unconstitutional monarchist, a devout Roman Catholic, and a strong believer in the limitations placed upon humans by Adam's original sin. Now, I think this is a crude simplification of Richard Wagner. At best, it characterizes his earliest phases, but in time, he radically changed his ideas about philosophy and politics to be much, and they were much more in line with Arthur Schopenhauer, with his pessimistic philosophy emphasizing the tragedy of life and the limitations of human nature. But nonetheless, we can see that there is a potential conflict here, which may support Tolkien's original assertion. Nonetheless, what I want to do here is go through first two tropes that we find in Tolkien, which do not derive from the original Scandinavian mythology, but are found in Wagner. To put it another way, Wagner invented these ideas or brought together elements in the original mythology in a unique way, and we find them repeated in Tolkien, which would, if my argument's successful, it would imply that Tolkien was at least inspired by Wagner in these two respects. I want to start with one which is perhaps a little trivial. It's not essential to Tolkien's story, but there's a degree of comparison nonetheless. And this is between the Rhine Maidens and Goldberry. The Rhine Maidens play an important role within the Ring Cycle. They are actually the first characters that we meet in the Ring Cycle. So in Das Rheingold, which is the prelude to the other three, you might say it's the prologue, we open up on the state of innocent nature, and we're looking upon the river, the River Rhine, and its waters are flowing and flourishing, and the music is kind of weaving in and out, and there's this sense of creative potential resting within this boundless energy, which is reconfiguring, drawing apart, moving together, building up into new forms, and then deconstructing all at once, very much like the operas that are going to be taking place. And we see within the river three nymph-like creatures. They are the Rhine Maidens, and their essential task, they have been kind of, whether appointed or brought into being, children of nature itself, to guard the Rhine gold. This is the gold which lies at the riverbed of the Rhine. It's one of the most beautiful things. When the sun shines upon it, they sing in praise, Rhine gold, and they invite others to come and delight to bask in its glory. Now, we meet these creatures, these frolicking, delightful creatures, and then out of a crevice in the ground emerges a dwarf, an ugly, misshapen, dark dwarf named Alberich. And he sees the Rhine maidens, and he wants to catch them. He says he wants to catch one of them so he can make love to them. Now, we might question what he means by love here, because there's no sense in which he genuinely loves any one of the Rhine maidens. And this can be seen in that he'll chase after one, and then when it rejects him, he'll go immediately to the next Rhine maiden and say, "Oh, you are now the most beautiful." They're interchangeable to him. Rather, what he really wants is to use them for sexual pleasure, to satisfy him, to sate his will. And so he goes on a merry dance trying to catch these elegant, dashing Rhine maidens who are able to elude his grasp. So we have this kind of we have this kind of archetype then of these nymph-like creatures who, what would we say? They're neither good nor evil in a way. They kind of play, they mock Alberich. So they're not exactly perfect, but they're these innocent sort of beings who are immensely beautiful, are associated with gold in the river, and a creature tries to catch them to then have love with one of them, right? Well, in the original creation of Tom Bombadil, in the poem that Tolkien first wrote about Tom Bombadil many years before The Lord of the Rings, we find a somewhat similar situation. Bombadil is, as we know, a merry fellow, and he's been walking through the old forest. He is first dragged into the water of the Withywindle by Goldberry, but singing the right song sends her to sleep and escapes. He is then caught by Old Man Willow, but again he sings the right song and he sends Old Man Willow to sleep. The same happens with badgers and then with the Barrow-wights. And so there is this idea, which we see in The Lord of the Rings, that Tom has never been caught. That's a line that we find Goldberry say. He's not been caught. He can always get away. And he always knows the song to sing, which puts the creature trying to catch him right, sets them in their right place. And then we find the following verses after all of this. Wise old Bombadil, he was a wary fellow. Bright blue his jacket was, and his boots were yellow. None ever caught old Tom in upland or in dingle, walking the forest paths, or by the Withywindle, or out on the lily pools, in boat upon the water. But one day Tom, he went and caught the river daughter, in green gown, flowing hair, sitting in the rushes, singing old water songs to birds upon the bushes. He caught her, held her fast. Water rats went scuttering, reeds hissed, herons cried, and her heart was fluttering. Said Tom Bombadil, here's my pretty maiden, you shall come home with me. The table is all laden. Yellow cream, honeycomb, white bread and butter, roses at the window sill, and peeping round the shutter. You shall come under hill. Never mind your mother. In her deep weedy pool, there you'll find no lover. Old Tom Bombadil had a merry wedding, crowned all with buttercups, hat and feather shedding. His bride with forget-me-nots and flag lilies for garland was robed all in silver green. He sang like a starling, hummed like a honeybee, lilted to the fiddle, clasping his river maid round her slender middle. Lamps gleamed within his house, and white was the bedding. In the bright honey moon, badger folk came treading, danced down under hill, and old man Willow tapped at window pane as they slept on pillow. On the bank in the reeds, river woman sighing, heard old Barrowhite in his mound crying. Old Tom Bombadil heeded not the voices, taps, knocks, dancing feet, all the nightly noises. Slept till the sun arose, then sang like a starling. Hey, come, Derry Doll, Merry Doll, my darling. Sitting on the doorstep, chopping sticks of willow, while fair Goldberry combed her tresses yellow. So we have, again, a similar kind of archetype and narrative here. We have this beautiful nymph-like creature which belongs in the water. She's the river woman's daughter. She's the daughter of the river, just as the Rhine maidens are the daughter of Erda, the mother of the earth, who is identified with the Rhine. She is also associated with the gold of the river. Her name is Goldberry, just as the Rhine maidens guard the gold of the Rhine. And just as as Alberic tries to catch the Rhine maidens to have a loving relationship with them, or sexual relations with them, although he calls it love, Bombadil catches Goldberry to make her his wife and to make her his lover. And there is an implicit sexual connotation here, or erotic connotation. We have this idea of bedding, the mention of honeymoon, sighing. There is this sense that this isn't just a platonic relationship, they are a genuine husband and wife. And perhaps this is an example of what Shippy was saying, that Tolkien thought he was correcting the mistakes in Wagner. Why does Alberic fail? He doesn't catch them because he does not genuinely love the Rhine maidens. He just lusts after them. Whereas Bombadil genuinely loves Goldberry, and this enables him to catch her, to make her his own, and she in turn is able to reciprocate that. She wants to be with such a man. And as I said earlier, this is a unique creation of Wagner's The Rhine Maiden. Although we find nymphs and other creatures in various mythologies, there is no three nymphs quite like the Rhine maidens with their association with the Rhine gold. So that would be the first example of a trope in Wagner that doesn't belong in the mythology, isn't there originally, but also ends up in a way in Tolkien. And there are references to this episode within the Lord of the Rings if you know what you're looking for. They're not explicit enough that you could get all of this, but they are referring to this poem, which I just think is amazing, just wonderful. There's always so much more depth every time you reread the Lord of the Rings or read it in relationship to another text. It's fantastic. But you know that already, guys, right? That's why you're here. So let's look at the second comparison then. And this one goes to the very heart of both tales. And it is actually the rings themselves. How to put it? Well, before we get there, let me say hello again to everybody in the chat, and thank you all for tuning in. Please feel free to put your comments in the chat and respond to what I'm saying. Vingal has said that the river nymphs are mentioned in the Nibelungenlied. River nymphs may be mentioned, but the idea of the Rhine maidens in itself, there's no mention of the word Rhine maiden, and the connection with Rhine gold, as I understand it, is also not in the text. But if there's a version that I've not come across, please do share, Fingal. I'm happy to be corrected on that point. So yes, moving on to the next section. The rings themselves are they are quite unique. The ring in the Wagner's ring cycle and in the Lord of the Rings doesn't find a direct parallel within the older mythology. Now let me kind of explain this, because the natural comparison is with Andvari's ring. Andvari was a dwarf, quite like Alberich, who forged a ring. And this ring gave him the power to produce more wealth, or more rings in some versions. So it would produce more and more rings, or more and more gold. And that was its primary purpose. There may be some connections with shapeshifting. Andvari was able to change into a fish. But that's the limit of this ring. By contrast, what we find in the ring cycle is Alberich's ring has many more qualities. I'm just trying to think what's the best way to explain this. Well, it shares with Andvari's ring the ability to generate more gold. That's taken from the mythology. But it also affords its wearer absolute power, the power to subjugate others to your will. And indeed, it is said that whoever has this ring will have power over the whole world and will be able to rule over the whole world. So he uses this ring. He forges it from the Rheingold, and we'll get into how later. And then he goes back down to Niflheim, which in this story is the underworld of the Dark Elves, or also known as the Dwarves. And he forces the Dwarves to work for him. They were quite happy making crafts for their wives and delighting in pleasing them. But he subjugates them, he bullies them through this new power that he's got, and forces them to mine for gold for him. At the same time, he has great plans to bring the gods in Valhalla down to his level, out of resentment, essentially. He is peak resentful individual. The absolute slave morality of Nietzsche can be seen in Alberich. And he wants to bring Wotan down to his level, renounce love, and also be consumed by a greed for gold, but at the same time working for him. Well, Alberich in time has this ring taken from him by Wotan, and he then curses the ring. He places a curse upon the ring and who wears it. He says, whoever will wear this ring will not gain the satisfaction they desire, but will be in a life of constant misery, sorrow, anxiety about losing it. Moreover, others will desire this ring too. It will be all-consuming as a form of temptation. And it will bring people to kill each other, essentially, over it. And finally, the possessor of it, who will be known as the Lord of the Ring, will die. They will be killed because of their possession of this ring. Now, Arthur Morgan, the scholar Arthur Morgan, has noted that all of these traits together cannot be identified with any ring in the prior mythologies. Wagner has done something unique in bringing all these qualities into this one ring. And as those of you who have read The Lord of the Rings will know, it has striking similarities to the ring in The Lord of the Rings. Or not identical in its history or story, but certainly in its qualities. The One Ring is forged by Sauron as a means by which he can have total power over the whole world and subjugate all others to his will. It is a source of not contentment for those others who wear the ring, such as Gollum, but of perpetual agony. He loves and hates it. He wants it with all his being, so it has that tempting quality and drives him to murder his own brother for it. Actually, kind of like the ring in the ring cycle causes one giant to kill his brother for it. But at the same time, he is revulsed by it and is in agony and pain because of it, existential pain, because of his possession of the ring. And ultimately, it dooms those who wear it. Pretty much every ring bearer ends up is wounded by carrying the ring in some way or another. And I use wounded in quite a broad sense. So let's think. So ring bearers. Well, Sauron, he meets his end. Isildur, Gollum, they meet their ends. Boromir tries to get the ring, meets his end. He's possessed by a desire for it because he believes it will. Well, he's tempted by the dual prospects: the virtuous notion of defending his nation through the power of the ring, but also the elevation he will have through that to king-like status of Gondor. And Frodo himself, Frodo and Bilbo, are both left changed by their experiences of the ring, and this is physically conveyed to us by the fact that Frodo has one of his fingers missing, and the wound which the Witch King inflicted upon him never heals within this world. The physical pain, mirrors the emotional and mental turmoil that he has gone through, and will remain with him until he finds rest in the heavenly realm, let's say. So I think there's a convincing argument here that Tolkien's ring is very similar to Wagner's ring. And given that this ring in this form didn't exist in previous literature, it's a reasonable conclusion to draw that Tolkien was at least inspired by Wagner's ring in various ways. So the idea that just their roundness is all that's the same, that they're both gold rings, seems like on Tolkien's part primarily a reaction to that terrible introduction by the Swedish author, the Swedish translator. So those are just two unique similarities. There are many others, but they could also be compared to the original source material, so I don't find them as convincing. So let us move on, though, to maybe the kind of philosophical ideas or values in both works. Because it's one thing showing a narrative trope, a character, a kind of a motif is carried across, right? That's a kind of story aspect, the actual story itself. But you could have a similar plot with different values underlying them, and maybe that's where there's more interest in putting these two thinkers, two artists together. And the natural place to begin is with the concepts of power, or the dangers of power within both works. As alluded to earlier, in his younger days, Richard Wagner was something of a revolutionary. He participated in the Dresden Revolution. And in these days, he was something of a mix of an anarchist socialist. He was good friends with Bakunin, who was one of the key anarchist thinkers of the period. He was heavily influenced by Ludwig Feuerbach's socialism. He was also informed by Hegelianism of various kinds. And we might briefly summarize Wagner's point of view in this period as such. We have to imagine that in the original state of nature, think like Rousseau, right? The leftist paradigm assumes that in the original state of nature, human beings were in good relations with one another, and that's because we are naturally good. That's the fundamentally left-wing view of the world. And that in this state of nature, all of us existed in equal relationships with one another. They they cooperate with one another freely without infringing upon each other's dignity and rights. But this becomes disrupted. This harmonious state of being is destroyed when the strong decide to assert their will over the weak, when they use force to take away or violate the rights and integrity of other beings and use them as mere instruments of their will. And this, for Bakunin and by extension for Wagner, is the basis of all political arrangements in the contemporary world. That one group has used force to subjugate and exploit another group. As such, no system of government has any moral legitimacy on this view. It's like they may try to claim moral legitimacy and that they uphold the moral order, but they can only do so because they've stolen that authority, which was never theirs in the first place. It's an act of theft. And we see this represented in the ring cycle in two parallel ways. On the one hand, we have the character of Alberich, who we've already mentioned. Now, after he tries to catch the Rhine maidens and fails, they then praise the Rheingold. The sun shines down on the Rheingold, and they start praising it. And they reveal to Alberich, perhaps naively, that he who renounces love can take the Rheingold and forge it into the ring of power. But they don't fear Alberich because they believe that he is so consumed by love. They conflate the two. Perhaps that's where they fell down. He's not going to be able to renounce love because what being can? Love is life. And so no being can truly reject it. That's the kind of assumption here. Well, Alberich, in resentment, hurt by the rejection of the Rhine maidens, embraces it, accepts his fate, and says, no, I will renounce love. And he essentially, just as he tried to rape the Rhine maidens, rapes nature. He takes the Rheingold and forges it into this ring of power. So it's an act of theft, which then grounds his use of force against the dwarves later on. He only has this strength because he has stolen it. It wasn't his to take. And in so doing, and it's interesting because the Niflheim is represented as a kind of industrial hellhole in Wagner's ring cycle. So we can see then an allusion to his own time period, that this unjust political structure where the strong dominate the weak finds itself manifested in industrial capitalism, where the bourgeoisie are using the proletariat as mere machines, extensions of their will to grow their wealth, all the while demeaning them, degrading them, and wrongly taking away their right to independence and freedom. It sounds quite Marxist, and I think Wagner I don't think he read Marx, but given Marx was heavily influenced by Feuerbach, we can see these overtones kind of from Feuerbach coming into Wagner. Although it should be said, somebody like John Ruskin, who wasn't a Marxist, would have held very similar views about industrialism and its ravaging of human society. Nevertheless, there is also another act of theft which is the basis of the moral and political order. And that is committed by Wotan, who um, Wagner's drawing on Norse depictions of Odin and Germanic Woden, but he's using Wotan as the name in the Ring Cycle. Before the story begins, we are later told that Wotan broke a branch off of the world ash tree, the tree of life. He essentially stole. He committed an act of violence against this tree, took it, formed it into his spear, and with this spear, he writes upon it all the contracts that maintain his political power and the moral order. Through these contracts, he's able to secure peace. He's able to make the giants work for him. He's able to stop them from attacking the gods. He's able to ensure that the gods rule over the whole world. He's able to put into place laws which govern behavior and consequently determine whether somebody should be given reward or killed. But all of this rests on an act of theft, on an act of violence. And later, this kind of cycle is repeated, because at the beginning of the story, we learn that Wotan has contracted 2 giants to build Valhalla, the fortress of Valhalla, for him. And they have finished, and it is time for payment. And initially, he had promised one of the gods, Freya, the beautiful god Freya, in exchange for Valhalla. This would be a catastrophe for the gods, because her golden apples are the source of their immortality, their perpetual youthfulness, and without her they will begin to wither and, well, leave this mortal coil. So he must find another way of paying them, and he does so by stealing the ring from Alberich. He takes it by force from Alberich, and although tempted to keep it for himself, he finally relents and offers it to the giants in exchange for Valhalla and Freya, which they accept. So the whole moral order, maintained by force, is itself a lie. Because while it would tell us not to steal, it is based on stealing. While it would tell us not to use force to get one's way, it relied upon force Wotan's use of force to get his way. So it's hypocritical. It has no leg to stand upon. And so what we see in this kind of reading of the Ring Cycle, which corresponds with the early Wagner, what needs to take place is the overthrowing of all systems of power, indeed of power itself. And a new era must be brought into being, one which is dominated by the reign of love. And we find this really take place in the third opera, Siegfried. There, the warrior hero Siegfried, he slays the dragon Fafnir, and he is sent essentially on a quest towards this flaming mountain. Evola has spoken about the spiritual significance of the mountain as the place of transfiguration, the place of becoming the full hero, the one who masters himself and is in connection with the transcendent. And Siegfried goes in search of that which will make him afraid. He's never been afraid of anything before, but he learns that atop this mountain he will find something which will make him afraid. And on his way, he meets an old man with a staff and one eye. We know this is Wotan, but Siegfried doesn't know this. And he blocks Siegfried's way with his spear. Siegfried takes his sword, no tongue, reforged, and breaks down the spear, cleaves it in two, thus destroying Wotan's power. He then ascends up the mountain through the flames as only the courageous hero can, and meets for the first time in his life a woman, Brunhilde. They almost immediately fall in love. And this then is the the utopian age essentially brought into being by Siegfried's act. He has destroyed the illegitimate power, and a new reign of love will take place, where restoring the natural order. And I guess I'm drawing from the opera here. There will be a community of love where each will have his own land, each will have their own independent means, but will naturally want to cooperate with one another to create a better society. There will be no force needed. Now, I think let's put this into conversation with Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. I think Tolkien would agree with Wagner that power has the ability to be evil and to corrupt those who have it. And we see with this, with the ring itself, as it's interesting because one of the criticisms I've come across people making of the Lord of the Rings is that, oh, Sauron's not that engaging of a villain. He's off in the distance somewhere. And although his minions come against the Fellowship, against Frodo, who's trying to destroy the ring in Mount Doom, although these are obstacles that must be overcome, Sauron himself never really poses a great threat to Frodo, right? But I think this totally misses the point, because the ring has within it Sauron's very being. Many of his characteristics, his cruelty, his malice, and desire to rule all life. And although it is not identical with Sauron, it's not Sauron's consciousness within the ring, we might say. It is an extension of himself. And so the ring, which is really the main villain of the Lord of the Rings, it is the thing which causes the most danger to the heroes. The ring is effectively Sauron, the effect of Sauron, the danger of Sauron. And what does the ring do? Well, when the Fellowship set off, Frodo, the ring bearer, with his companions on their way to Mordor to destroy the ring in the fire of Mount Doom. Again, a mountain, again, a place of transfiguration, right? What does it do? Well, it tries to tempt other members of the Fellowship to take the ring by force. And its primary effect is upon Boromir, who, as I alluded to earlier, tries to take it from Frodo, justifying it on the basis that it will help him defend his people, which is a noble ambition. But also implicit in his words is this idea of, it will lead me to become the great warrior. So there's this self-elevation there. It also tempts from afar Saruman, the wizard Saruman. The 5 wizards had been sent to Middle-earth to help the free peoples, resist Sauron. They weren't to become kings or rulers, but rather were facilitators, supporters, people who could orchestrate but couldn't lead from the front. They had to kind of push others to do that for themselves. But Saruman was proud, and he believed that he had the right to rule. His knowledge, his desire to order things accordingly, should be imposed upon the world. And so he desires the ring for that purpose. And additionally, it will mean he will get to rule the world. So there is this sense in which a noble ambition, such as defending your own country, or wanting to bring order and peace to the known world, can be exploited by the temptation of power. That the opportunity of being able to do these things may lead someone to break bonds of fellowship, to commit acts of murder, and ultimately to treat the whole of reality as just an extension of their will, and that any obstacle should be destroyed to that. Perhaps this idea is best seen in the temptation of Sam. Sam gets the ring, actually. He takes it from Frodo's body when he thinks Frodo is dead after the Shelob's attack. the spider who had poisoned Frodo. And he learns by overhearing some orcs that Frodo is actually still alive. And he has the choice at that point to go in and save Frodo or to go on and complete the quest himself. At the moment, he is tempted by the ring with a vision of him as a mighty warrior striding across Mordor to go and overthrow Sauron, and then turning the whole of Mordor into a lovely green garden. That's a beautiful vision. What a beautiful thing. How wholesome is Samwise Gamgee that the only way the ring can tempt him is by giving him the power, or promising him the power, to turn what is a dead and ugly land into one brimming with life, brimming with greenery and gardens and all the things which make life beautiful. But that's where the danger of power is. It gives one the illusion that they have the right to turn the world according to their desires, to their whims, without thought of any other being. And tying into that, pride, the placing of the self in a status above what is rightfully theirs. But I think that maybe gets to, we can connect this though with another idea in Tolkien, because I don't think Tolkien would have agreed with the young Wagner that power is in itself evil. How to put this? We can see this in a very clear example. What is the third book called? The Return of the King. Aragorn returns to Gondor and becomes king of his people, and this leads to their restoration, their liberation from the tyranny of Sauron, and the renewal of the nation. Their culture flourishes, the lands grow once more, the territories that they once had are reclaimed up in the north. And peace is established with the other nations. The factions that fought for Sauron no longer harass Gondor's borders. As in the movie Excalibur, there is this great line, "The king is the land and the land is the king." And I think Tolkien is presenting that with The Return of the King. Aragorn's ascension to the throne restores the land of Gondor. Now, if he was critical of the idea of power, if he thought power was always illegitimate, always an act of theft, and needed to be eradicated, this doesn't gel well at all with that narrative. What I think he'd rather say is that power doesn't have its origins in theft and murder and the use of force. Rather, power has its origin in God, who is the ultimate power. God is, and in Middle-earth, that is Iluvatar, the All-Father, right? The Father of all beings. And he appoints the order of reality. He, through his instruments, the Valar, beings created from his own thought, he has brought into being a world which has a moral order which has been structured in accordance with his design. And this includes a metaphysical order in which some beings are higher and some beings are lower. Some creatures are meant to rule, others are meant to serve. This might be called the great chain of being. And so Aragorn's authority to be king of Gondor does not derive from his ancestors stealing that right. No, through the course of history, his people are descended from those who have been appointed to such a position. And indeed, if you read the story of Numenor, you know that the kings of Numenor were descended from those who had achieved mighty feats and were rewarded as such. So it actually flows from a recognition of their greatness that that line was established. That what they did against Morgoth justified their being rulers. So what's then the problem of the ring? The problem of the ring is that it tempts you with power to usurp a position which is not rightfully yours. So with Saruman, he's not meant to be a ruler, but the lure of power, the idea that he, as the anointed one, could save the world, means that he tries to become that character. With Boromir, he is a mighty warrior. He is a great captain of Gondor, but it is not his place to become his people's leader, indeed its king. But the temptation of using kingly power to save his people via the ring tempts him to see himself in that position and want that for himself. Sam is able to resist the temptation of the ring because he recognizes that being a mighty ruler who governs a country like Mordor and turns it into a lovely garden is too big for him. He says, essentially, I'm quite content with my little garden. That's what's appointed to me. That's what's allotted to me in the great chain of being. So I think we could make the argument then that although Tolkien would share some of Wagner's concerns about the nature of power, that it can be a corruptive force, that it can be illegitimate, and it can wreak havoc, he would disagree with the idea that all power is illegitimate, all power is derived from force. This seems to be a key difference within the Ring Cycle and between the Ring Cycle and the Lord of the Rings. I think, though, that we can see a change in Wagner following his reading of Schopenhauer. I don't want to get into Schopenhauerian metaphysics today. We're going to hear all about that on Wagner Day and its impact upon Wagner. But maybe one of the key ideas is this, that in his earlier days, Wagner thought that the suffering, exploitation, and evil that he witnessed in his contemporary society belonged to a particular phase of history. That if the regime was overthrown, if the systems, the political system and hierarchy was overthrown, then there could be a society of love and happiness and flourishing and prosperity for all. So he thought, if we just get rid of what's now, these evil systems now, these evil ways of relating to each other, we can then have good ones. But in his later life, Wagner came to the view that actually no, the suffering and exploitation, the abuses of power, and so on, don't just belong to a particular phase in history. They belong to all of history. That all of life is one of suffering, is one of tragedy, and is one of death. There is no ultimate political redemption in this world. And funnily enough, he came to recognize that in his own libretto of the Ring Cycle, that is the words that he had written for the Ring Cycle, this idea was already there, even though he didn't realize it. It had unconsciously come forth in the text. How so? Well, we see it in the fourth and final opera, Götterdämmerung, the Twilight of the Gods. In this opera, we've just had it opens just after we've had the great revolution, let's say. Siegfried and Brunhilde are united in love. Wotan's political moral order has been broken with the breaking of his spear. And Indeed, Siegfried has been able to overcome the ring. He's not tempted by the allure of power. He doesn't know it has that power, and he offers it freely to Brunhilde as a token of his love. But these two innocent, loving heroes are dragged down into the murky world of humanity by three individuals: Hagen, the son of Alberich, and his two half siblings, Gunther and Gudrun. Hagen manages to manipulate the situation so that Siegfried is given a potion by Gudrun where he forgets his love of Brunhilde and falls in love with Gudrun. And in turn, he promises to help Gunther to attain Brunhilde as his own wife. I won't go into all of the details as to how, but what happens then is Siegfried betrays his love for Brunhilde. Unintentionally does so, but nonetheless does. This leads to his murder and death, the death of Gunther as well, and ultimately all ends with Brunhilde plunging herself into the funeral fire of Siegfried with the ring and returning it to the Rhine to the Rhine maidens. The point being is that this reign of love could not last forever. The deceits of human nature, the desire for power, will never disappear. And creatures like Hagen will destroy what is good in the pursuit of it. Others like Gunther and Gudrun, who didn't really love Siegfried or Brunhilde, but desired the higher status which would come with marrying such heroes, they are easily manipulated by those who want power, because they themselves want a kind of soft power, right? So Gotterdammerung is the objection to this idea that we can achieve a utopia. Actually, we can, maybe for a time, we can find such love, we can establish a new way of being, but ultimately it'll be dragged down once again into this murky world. And thus the only solution is one of resignation from the world, the destruction of all. So when the Brunhilde goes into the fire, she sends it forth to Valhalla too, to burn the fortress of the gods, which Wotan's quite happy about. He's in this story, and this is perhaps the biggest change from the Norse mythology. He doesn't fight against his promised fate. He resists. He doesn't resist. He's actually wants to end. He wants to end the world because he, as a power-driven individual, sees the pain and suffering that it will cause, and so it's better just to do away with it all than for it to continue. Very Schopenhauerian. There's a similar idea in Tolkien, actually. We see this with the Scouring of the Shire. So, a little bit of context. Our heroes have managed to destroy the ring. Frodo has triumphed, ultimately. And Sauron is defeated. The forces of Mordor are broken. Aragorn has returned as king of Gondor, and there's promise of a new age. The fourth age has begun. And there will be rebuilding, new growth, and a time of prosperity and peace. But as the hobbits, Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin, make their way back to the Shire, their beloved homeland, they discover that it has been ravaged, that in their absence, it has been taken over by the acolytes of Saruman. These thugs who bully the hobbits, force them into working for them, taking their product and selling it abroad or transporting it abroad. They are erecting horrible, ugly structures. They are cutting down trees just for the sake of it. They're polluting the water and air. And we discover later they have murdered a number of the hobbits, those who resisted. Now, our heroes are able to they're able to restore the Shire. They clean this all away. They scour it away, you might say, clean it away, and they're able to rebuild and renew the Shire to a level that it hadn't attained before. It actually becomes better after this. But I think there's an important point here that actually you might be able to defeat the Dark Lord, but there'll always be another battle. Evil never goes away. And indeed, in this case, it managed to come into the one place we thought that was always safe from the power of Mordor and from Sauron, from the dark places, the home, the English rural countryside of the Shire, which is a representation of that. And this, I think, corresponds to Tolkien's. In one of his lectures, he describes the Anglo-Saxon worldview as being something like this: that you have your great hall, hero rot, right? That in the poem Beowulf, where warriors and kings meet, and kings will give out golden rings to their followers and trinkets. There'll be feasting and storytelling. But outside of the hall is a wilderness, a dangerous place filled with monsters and demons who want to destroy the world of men and gods. And so there is this kind of frontier mentality or siege mentality where you live in this haven where all these dark forces are constantly trying to break in and disrupt and destroy. We see this in the Lord of the Rings, right? So outside of the Shire, which is one of these havens, the world is dangerous. There are orcs and wolves and trolls. The forces of Mordor are sent abroad to hunt down our heroes. And there's a few refuges in these wild places. There's Rivendell, there's Lothlorien, but beyond that, there's not necessarily a safe place to go. It's like a sea within which there's a couple of islands where you can make port. But even those islands are at risk of being subsumed in the ocean. In that kind of model, there's a sense in which defeat is ultimately inevitable. Tolkien saw this in the story of Ragnarok, that although Odin and the gods and the Einherjar, the chosen warriors, will resist the monsters and demons, they are unable to, and it is a matter of fate. They cannot change fate. And indeed, this is the case for all that is good, that it will ultimately meet its untimely demise. In The Lord of the Rings, this is called the long defeat. It is inevitable that, whether it be Sauron, Morgoth, some other evil, ultimately there will be defeat and destruction. I think for Tolkien, this is also true of the world, and that it is beyond human power to overcome these difficulties, these threats to civilization and peaceful living, because it is in our nature to turn to the pursuit of power for its own sake, when it is not ours to take, to the exploitation and degradation of other beings. It is inevitable, and he saw that in his own lifetime with World War I and World War II, the violence and bloodshed. And then also afterwards, the destruction of the rural countryside around Birmingham with the growth of the suburbs and modern industry and commercial endeavors. No, the only way for Tolkien that this can be redeemed is by divine intervention of some kind. That point at which everything looks like it's lost, when human power has been exhausted and the divine rescues the day. We see that kind of template throughout the Lord of the Rings. Not exactly in that way, but like little images of that. So think of the Battle of Helm's Deep, where the men of Rohan are utterly exhausted. They've been pretty much defeated by the Uruk-hai. They make one last heroic charge and stand. And then on the hill, Gandalf arrives with reinforcements, and they win the day. That's kind of how Tolkien sees the world. And as a Roman Catholic, he believes that really, it'll only be with the return of Jesus Christ that we will finally overcome the long defeat. So I think Tolkien and Wagner shared this this conviction that there cannot be, by human hand alone, by human hand alone, by our own strength, the victory which leads to utopia. Political victory can only attain temporary respite from the forces of darkness. For Wagner, this meant that we should resign ourselves from the world, that we should seek escape in the solace of death. Not by suicide, but embracing, embracing kind of the negation of existence. For Tolkien, that meant fighting as hard as we can until the divine can come and save the day. But both agreed that our temporary victories must be recognized as temporary. So let us move on then to maybe the third and final kind of major theme that I wanted to discuss and which arose in my mind. And I'd call this, how to put it? Maybe we could call it compassion, mercy, pity, something like that. It has its beginning point in both Wagner and Tolkien's conviction that we have to recognize the otherness of other beings, that they have a life apart from our own, and that we need to recognize that they have a unique perspective. In Wagner, we see this idea most fully brought out in his final opera, Parsifal. There is a scene in which the young boy Parsifal, who he's called the pure fool. He doesn't really know anything about the world. He's quite naive. He doesn't think about anybody else. He just kind of acts upon his impulses and desires. And he sees a swan flying overhead. And just on a whim, because he can do it, he shoots the bird down and kills it. He is then kind of brought before the Knights of the Grail, who are astounded by this act. They are pretty horrified at what Parsifal has done. And one of the knights, let me see if I can get his exact name because I always get it wrong. Gurnemans, a veteran Knight of the Grail, an old mentor figure who seems to know what's going on and has insight into the fundamental nature of things. And actually, this painting here, I know its original author had said that it could be original painter, the artist who did this. He said that it could be Saint Oswald or the Knight Oswald, but I like to think of him as Gurnemans and Knight of the Grail. And Gurnemans speaks to Parsifal. He says, "Why did you do this?" And he then goes on to teach the boy that the swan had a life of its own, that it had risen into the air in search of its mate, that it desired to create or to reproduce and have a new family, that it had its own being and integrity, and had done nothing to Parsifal. In the process, Parsifal learns that he can't just think of his own desires and wishes. He should recognize that when he does something, it affects other beings, and that he needs to be conscious of how that happens. That he shouldn't just act in ways which hurt other beings for no reason, right? And so he becomes quite remorseful. He then learns from a character called Kundry, who we will return to. She's a kind of hard to put it. Well, we'll return to her, but she essentially reveals that Parsifal has caused great grief for his mother because, as a young boy, his mother kept him away from society, raised him in the woods, because she feared that if he saw knights and soldiers and so on, he would want to become one. And as such, like his father, he would be killed as a knight. But one day in the forest, Parsifal witnessed a group of men riding horses with armor and weapons, and he wanted to become one of them. So he ran off, chased off after them. In the process, he went over hills and mountains, through valleys, forests, fought trolls and goblins and dwarves, and became a fearful thing to all the monsters in the world. But he never found the knights, and he completely forgot about his mother. Indeed, he didn't think once about her. This episode, then, through this revelation, he learns that actually what he did affected his mother. That she had a perspective which he did not think of, and his leaving caused her great grief. So much so that she died of her sorrow. Again, this leads into great remorse. We have a somewhat similar idea emerge in The Lord of the Rings. One example: when the hobbits, the four hobbits, Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin, are residing at the house of Tom Bombadil, the old merry fellow starts to tell and sing them various stories, and these are stories about the nature of the land that they've been walking through. And let me find the passage because I think there's a precise use of wording which I think is it's not an accident. So here we go. Bombadil then told them many remarkable stories, sometimes half as if speaking to himself, sometimes looking at them suddenly with a bright blue eye under his deep brows. Often his voice would turn to song, and he would get out of his chair and dance about. He told them tales of bees and flowers, the ways of trees, and the strange creatures of the forest, about the evil things and good things, things friendly and things unfriendly, cruel things and kind things, and secrets hidden under brambles. As they listened, the hobbits began to understand the lives of the forest apart from themselves, indeed to feel themselves as the strangers where all other things were at home. And he goes on to kind of explain the life of Old Man Willow, for example, this tree which had attacked the hobbits. They learn that his animosity comes from a deep anger caused by men chopping down trees. It's a kind of resentment and revenge which drives him, and so on and so forth. There's a passage in On Fairy Stories which Tolkien again kind of expands upon this idea, and I wanted to read a little bit about it here. He's describing one of the purposes of a fantasy story. Recovery, which includes return and renewal of health, is a regaining of a clear view. I do not say seeing things as they are, and involve myself with the philosophers, though I might venture to say seeing things as we are or were meant to see them, as things apart from ourselves. We need in any case to clean our windows so that the things seen clearly may be freed from the drab blur of triteness or familiarity, from possessiveness. Of all faces, those of our familiars are the ones both most difficult to play fantastic tricks with, and most difficult really to see with fresh attention, perceiving their likeness and unlikeness, that they are faces, and yet unique faces. This triteness is really the penalty of appropriation. The things that are trite, or in a bad sense familiar, are the things that we have appropriated, legally or mentally. We say we know them. They have become like the things which once attracted us by their glitter, or their colour, or their shape, and we laid hands on them, and then locked them in our hoard, acquired them, and acquiring, ceased to look at them. He goes on to say, creative fantasy, because it is mainly trying to do something else, make something new, may open your hoard and let all the locked things fly away like caged birds. The gems will turn into flowers or flames, and you will be warned that all you had or knew was dangerous and potent, not really effectively chained, free and wild, no more yours than they were you. I think that's a really interesting last line there. No more yours, so they're not your possession, they're not something that you have a right to rule over, than they were you. That's more than just a kind of economic ownership of something, right? When you own a house, you don't say, oh, this is me. This ties into his idea of mentally appropriating an object. What we do is we treat it as if it's just an extension of our will or something to be used by us. And that's only where its value lies. That's where its only value lies in this view. So we don't really appreciate it as a being which is distinct from ourselves, which has a unique life, which isn't governed by how we think or act. And such fresh attention helps us to fall in love once again with the world around us. Fairy stories and fantasy stories help us to recover that because they present that which is familiar in a unique and strange way, which draws out those properties, and in so doing creates a kind of separateness. It helps us to see our separateness from those things. So, for example, the Ents in The Lord of the Rings convey to us that trees are living beings, that they're not just objects, dead objects to be used at our own leisure. They actually have a life, which is apart from ourselves, the life of the forest, the wood, which, when we're not there, is still going on with everything that happens there. We can never visit that tree and it still has a value and an integrity. The Ents help us to see that by showing us the tree in a more lively way. And I guess The Lord of the Rings as a whole is meant to do that. Put another way, we're being taught by Wagner and Tolkien that we have to be conscious of the otherness of the other. And in so doing, we will have a restored relationship with the other as well. We will treat it rightly. This leads to a further idea, important in both, and this is the idea of compassion. Which way around should I do this? Let's start with Wagner's Parsifal again. So later in the opera, Parsifal is being tempted by Kundry into a sexual relationship with her. This is part of the evil wizard's plan to destroy the chastity of Parsifal, thereby making him fallen, profaning him, and thus he will be unable to restore the sacred objects, the holy spear, to the holy community at Montsalvat, the community of the Grail. However, at the moment that they kiss, Parsifal has a unique experience. He feels within him the pain and sorrow that is being experienced by the king of the Knights of the Grail, Amfortas. And he cries out, Amfortas, Wund, Wund. He feels the wound within himself. You know what? I might actually see if I can find this bit, because it's in the. It's just so powerful. Die Wund, die Wund. Hopefully, we don't get a copyright strike for this. Maybe it's this one. Okay, let's see. Is this going to work, my friends? I think this is important as well, because Wagner isn't just a text, and it's not just a set of ideas. It's a work of art, and you can't really appreciate its fullness of the values within it without feeling them, experiencing them in this visible, tangible, auditory way. So if I can find the right one. Okay, hopefully this works. If the sound doesn't work, please just say, and we'll see what happens. Can you hear that, guys? So you get that this is a very passionate moment for Parsifal, and he's just broken off this kiss, and he's crying out, "Amfortas, the wound, the wound." Let me see. There's another. I'm sure I saw a version earlier. Maybe it's this one. I saw a version earlier. Oh, it could be this one. This might have text here. You're getting a repeat. So we see with this moment that he doesn't just have a knowledge of Amfortas's suffering, he actually feels it within himself. We read here, "I saw the wound bleeding." So Amfortas has this physical wound caused by the Holy Spear, but it is a visible manifestation of his existential suffering. Now, there's various interpretations, but we might say one is that he has lost the Holy Spear, and he is in such, he has become a profaned thing. He is no longer holy. And so, in the presence of that which is sacred, he is brought into torment, right? And so, every time the Grail is brought forth, his wound opens up and he is in agony. And so, Parsifal feels this within himself. Flows in streams my blood from it. Here in my heart is the flame, the longing, the terrible longing which seizes and grips all my senses. It's all consuming. This is what Roger Scruton identifies as sympathy. Whereas empathy is an identification with the other, understanding their motives and feelings. Sympathy is feeling with another. We actually experience their emotions for ourselves. And this isn't just an unconscious thing, it's a kind of intuitive knowing of how, or a felt knowing of how another feels. This then becomes the basis for compassion, the suffering for another one, the putting of the other person's interests before one's own. Because Parsifal will then go on to pursue the quest of restoring the Holy Spear to the Grail community, healing Amfortas's wound, and thus providing him with relief and rest from his agony and anguish. He also does this for another character, Kundry. Kundry is very, very interesting. She's, to my mind, she's probably one of the most interesting characters in all of literature. She is a cursed woman from ancient days, cursed because when Christ was being crucified upon the cross, she did not show compassion for his suffering. She laughed at him. She mocked him. And as such, she is cursed to perpetual reincarnations, where she will never leave this mortal coil. She can never shed tears for what she did, but rather she can only laugh and rage and storm about the world. She tries to find relief through serving the knights of the Holy Grail. But she does so and she finds no atonement, no pardoning of her sins is coming forth. She is racked by guilt. At the same time, though, she is enslaved by the wizard Klingsor, who wants to use her to ensnare the Knights of the Grail through her sexual prowess. And one by one, they fall to the temptation of sexual relations with Kundry. She hates this. She hates that she is this object which is being used as a mere instrument of Klingsor's will. Uses her sexuality to destroy the purity of the Knights of the Holy Grail. But at the same time, there's a certain glee, there's a certain she revels and relishes in it to a certain degree. She sees herself so condemned that she just pursues it. This is who she is, and she must embrace this being that she's become, this damned reprobate who's unable to ever have peace in life. Her constant cry is she wants to go to sleep. She hates her waking life. But all the while she continues to endeavor on those behaviors which reinforce that state of damnation. And damnation here, I'm not talking about being in heaven and hell. I mean in her present condition. Parsifal understands her suffering and her sorrows. And rather than conceding to her illicit temptation, that the sexual relationship that she wants, he understands that she needs compassion. So later in Act 3, he offers that to her. In his first role as king of the Knights of the Holy Grail, anointed by Gurnemans, is that right? Gurnemans, to that with holy oil, much like Charles, right? His first act is to baptize her. This follows the fact that as he's being anointed with oil, she is washing his feet with her tears and her hair and perfume. This gives her release, right? She can begin to cry. She can begin to feel repentance for what she has done. She's no longer raging. And as a consequence, she finally finds rest. She eventually, she disappears. Her body just vanishes. She's found finally the release from this mortal life that she's been looking for. Wagner is heavily drawing on this story with the biblical tale of the woman who anointed Jesus's feet. And I thought I would just read that. Sometimes it's associated with Mary Magdalene, but it isn't in all of the Gospels. So let's get this up. And I should say though, because it might give the wrong impression, that Wagner, I think most scholars would say that he was not by any means an Orthodox Christian. He didn't believe that the Gospel stories were literally true, and I don't think he would have described himself as a Christian. If he did, it's because he would say he was a Christian insofar as he held that there were truths within Christianity about metaphysics and ethics, which he believed. But he also saw those in Buddhism or in Schopenhauer's philosophy. So it wasn't he didn't believe that Christianity was a unique revelation from God or something like that. Whereas Tolkien very much did. So that is a very key difference. But nonetheless, he's using this idea that we find in this story of Jesus anointed by a sinful woman. When one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. A woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house. So she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. As she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, "If this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner." Jesus answered him, "Simon, I have something to tell you." "Tell me, teacher," he said. Two people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of both. Now which of them will love him more? Simon replied, "I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven." "You have judged correctly," Jesus said. Then he turned toward the woman and said to Simon, "Do you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman, from the time I entered, has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little loves little." Then Jesus said to her, "Your sins are forgiven." The other guests began to say among themselves, "Who is this who even forgives sins?" Jesus said to the woman, "Your faith has saved you. You go in peace." So I think we can see very clear parallels between this story and with Parsifal, that Kundry washes and wipes Parsifal's feet, and then he offers her forgiveness. But we could say it's a recognition of the fact that his compassion has enabled him to understand and experience her suffering, and he, being for her, releases her, as it were. And the same is true of Amfortas. So it's not just a recognition of the otherness of another being. It's also feeling with them, suffering with them, and thus being for them as a consequence. It is agape, right? Loving the other, loving your neighbor as yourself, putting their interests ahead of your own will and ego. So rather than killing the swan, Parsifal should think of the swan's interests, and so on. But it's more than just thinking; it's feeling with it, right? So that's a very key theme in Parsifal, and it provides a different way of understanding one of the key ideas in Wagner's whole works, which is redemption through love. This is a musical motif in the Ring Cycle, and it finds expression in Tristan and Isolde and in Parsifal. But whereas in those ones it's through erotic love that there is potentially redemption, and that's identified with this kind of Feuerbachian socialist anarchist utopia. Here we have a recognition we cannot achieve political salvation, but there is redemption through the restoration of an individual from the sinful state, the fallen state of profanity, of being tainted with guilt, objectively and subjectively, and then through compassion, restoring them, reconciling with them, atoning for them. In the Lord of the Rings, there is a similar idea at play, actually. It might not have the same exact expression, but there is this key idea that keeps going, that we find throughout. And there's a very key passage in the Two Towers. So let me find it for you. And let me just say that we are coming towards the end of the stream. So if you have any comments or questions that you really want me to address, feel free to send super chat. I will look over the comments more broadly, but that would be the way to guarantee that I engage. But yes, so Frodo and Sam have just encountered the creature Gollum, who has tried to kill them. Gollum wants the ring for himself. He used to have it, and he lost it to Bilbo Baggins, Frodo's uncle. And Frodo, earlier in the story, had a conversation with Gandalf about this character. And in what happens, he remembers that conversation. He and Sam are trying to decide what to do with the wretched, ugly, monstrous little demon. And Frodo, this is the text now, it seemed to Frodo that he heard, quite plainly but far off, voices out of the past. What a pity Bilbo did not stab the vile creature when he had a chance. Pity? It was pity that stayed his hand. Pity and mercy, not to strike without need. I do not feel any pity for Gollum. He deserves death. Deserves death? I dare say he does. Many that live deserve death, and some die that deserve life. Can you give that to them? Then be not too eager to deal out death in the name of justice, fearing for your own safety. Even the wise cannot see all ends. Very well, Frodo answered aloud, lowering his sword. But still I am afraid. And yet, as you see, I will not touch the creature. For now that I see him, I do pity him. I think pity is a somewhat unfortunate term here, because pity implies like a superior, almost scornfully recognizing the suffering of another. Whereas I think Tolkien has in mind something rather different. And we can see this in the actual passage from The Hobbit, in which Bilbo pities Gollum. It's when he's trying to escape. Again, Gollum's trying to kill Bilbo, stop him taking the ring. And this is what happens. Gollum's blocking his way. Bilbo almost stopped breathing and went stiff himself. He was desperate. He must get away out of this horrible darkness while he had any strength left. He must fight. He must stab the foul thing, put its eyes out, kill it. It meant to kill him. No, not a fair fight. He was invisible now. Gollum had no sword. Gollum had not actually threatened to kill him, or tried to yet. And he was miserable, alone, lost. A sudden, understanding. A pity mixed with horror welled up in Bilbo's heart. A glimpse of endless unmarked days without light or hope of betterment. Hard stone, cold fish, sneaking and whispering. All these thoughts passed in a flash of a second. He trembled, and then quite suddenly in another flash, as if lifted by a new strength and resolve, he leaped. So this pity that Bilbo feels, it comes in a sudden moment where he has a fellow feeling with Gollum. He actually, since experiences, and this is a kind of knowledge, right? A felt knowledge of the loneliness, the despair, the terrible life that Gollum leads. He feels that. He sympathizes with it. And as such, he shows compassion. He could kill him quite easily. He could treat him like he's just an obstacle in the way, but he recognizes the illness. More than that, he feels the suffering of Gollum. And he decides, okay, I will show compassion. I will not put my own will first. To the extent I can, I will show mercy to this being. Frodo, then, we can assume, has a similar moment, and certainly is one who's carried the ring a fair distance, who's felt its temptations, its lure, its pull, its attempts to try and dominate the soul, and crush its will and subjugate it. He can feel what Gollum is going through. He has an insight into it, and so he spares his life. This, it turns out, is actually super critical to the whole of the Lord of the Rings, because it is Frodo's decision to show mercy, and this is something Tolkien spoke about a lot. Frodo's decision to show mercy to Gollum saves the day all the time later, because in Mount Doom itself, when Frodo has the opportunity to cast the ring into the lava below, thus destroying it and ending Sauron's threat to all reality, his will is finally broken. The ring triumphs, and he gives in. Not because of any fault on his part. He fought as hard as he could, but at that moment, at the very climax, he falls. He takes the ring for himself. He chooses not to destroy it and puts it on. All seems lost, right? The forces led by Aragorn at the Black Gate to cause a diversion will be destroyed. Eventually, Sauron will regain the ring, and all the people of Middle-earth will either be killed or enslaved by Sauron. They will become extensions of his will, all that's left, and the world will be cast into shadow and darkness. But just at that moment, when Frodo seems to have been defeated, who arrives but Gollum? He is possessed by lust for the ring, and in a kind of mad fury attacks Frodo. He manages to wrestle the ring off him, biting off his finger, and he, in absolute jubilation, dancing around the platform above the fires below, he slips and as such falls to his doom, and with him the ring. So from what looked like ultimate defeat and a cause for despair, there has been a great reversal, and there is now triumph. Sauron has been defeated, and Frodo's quest has been secured. And although his will was broken by the ring, his earlier show of compassion, his mercy, led to the ultimate victory. It is the eucatastrophe theme once again, right? So there is a key idea there of mercy, and actually after this point, Frodo sees it himself. Whereas before, at the start of the story, he, out of fear, he would have killed someone like Gollum, or at least advocated for that. The how to put it? He's become somebody who places mercy as the highest value. I think in part because he recognizes he too received a kind of mercy in that. He is aware that there is a higher power ordering the world, that darkness isn't, and Sauron's malevolence isn't the only thing working through the courses of events. That actually, Frodo may not know the name of this being, but he's aware that there's a providential power that is ordering events so that there are these great reversals. And so, in response to his earlier mercy, this being used that and brought it about so that Gollum would be there to fall with the ring in the end. So, although Frodo has failed, although he fell into the realm of guilt and left, you might say, the sacred for the profane, he too has been restored. He received atonement from that providential power. And so he shows that to others. So at the scouring of the Shire, he offers Saruman mercy. He informs the hobbits, do not kill him. Let him go. I hope for his repentance one day. He then, as Saruman's passing, he actually tries to kill Frodo. And his knife plunges towards his chest, but wearing the mithril armor as hard as dragon scale, it bounces off. And even at that point, when I think most of us would be inclined to say, yeah, he deserves death at that point, he should be executed for what's a pretty heinous act, right? Trying to kill somebody who's offering you a way out of the situation. Frodo says, no, still don't kill him. He didn't harm me. And, I respect that he is a mighty being, and I do hope that he will turn. He then offers Grima Wormtongue an opportunity at repentance. He says, Worm, you don't need to follow Saruman anymore. You could stay here, recover, and then go on your way. He shows him absolute compassion. But this might be where the difference lies with Wagner and Tolkien on this issue. They both agree that this is important. They both believe this is a good attitude to show to other beings, that we should recognize their otherness. A kind of anarchistic note in Tolkien seems to be there. But then also we should show compassion and mercy where we can to other beings, where they are not a threat or so on. But whereas for Wagner, this ultimately leads to the redemption of Amfortas, Kundry, indeed Parsifal himself. In Tolkien, some characters receive redemption, others do not. So Frodo, we could say he receives mercy in a sense through this providence, and ultimately he finds rest when he goes across. He leaves Middle-earth for Valinor, for the Holy Land, essentially. He's ascended into that realm. Perhaps Boromir receives a degree of redemption, that although he has fallen through his attempts to steal the ring from Frodo, he manages to fend off for a time the Uruk-hai from Merry and Pippin, and his heroism is certainly a restorative act, and he confesses all to Aragorn, who in turn offers him some degree of forgiveness. And if you know your stuff about ancient ideas of monarchy, then you'll know that the king is also doubles up as the high priest in a lot of traditions. Indeed, the basis of kingly authority, according to some writers, was primarily their connection to the sacred. But nonetheless, I think in the main, we find with the two characters we've mentioned, who are the explicit objects of compassion, who are people who have the opportunity of salvation, they are not saved. Let's see this first with Wormtongue. Well, Frodo makes this offer to him, and then Saruman, in a horrible way, this I should say first, Saruman has this domineering relationship with Worm at this point, where he treats him like an abusive owner of a dog, who nonetheless forces him to follow him wherever he'll go. And although Worm is in absolute torment and hates Saruman with every fiber of his being, he feels absolutely trapped and has become like this mad animal. Well, this gibbering wreck of an individual who once what had the intellectual foresight to advise the King of Rohan. Now, I know he did that for ill, but originally he seems to have been a wise man, or at least an articulate and intelligent individual. So Frodo makes this offer, and Saruman turns around and said, well, they're not going to let you stay here when they discover that you not only may have killed Lotho Pimple, the hobbit who was most to blame for the incursion of the ruffians, but that you may have also eaten him. And I want to get the exact quotation here, because last time I mentioned this, some of you were kind of surprised that there's a reference to cannibalism here. But I think when you hear it, you'll see. So, Saruman said, Worm killed your chief. Poor little fellow, your nice little boss. Didn't you, Worm? Stabbed him in his sleep, I believe. Buried him, I hope. The Worm has been very hungry lately. No, Worm is not really nice. You had better leave him to me. So it's definitely implied that, Saruman's definitely implying that because Wormtongue is a hungry individual, he may have eaten poor Lotho Pimple. I don't think we ever find out whether that's true or not. Let's just say, though, that's a really horrifying image, that in the heart of the Shire, the place of safety, peace, and beauty, that this act of cannibalism took place. Now, Worm is enraged by this. He said, you told me to do this. You told me to do this. And a deep revenge surfaces in his eyes, and he runs forward, stabs Saruman, and kills him. He, in turn, is killed himself. So although he was shown compassion, he didn't receive atonement and redemption. He ended in despair and destruction. The other character, of course, is Gollum. Although he becomes the instrument of redemption for the world, he himself is, well, let's think about this. Some people have said he does receive redemption by becoming this agent of the destruction of the ring. But I think that in himself, he himself is not atoned of his sin, right? He doesn't find salvation from the possession of the ring. He still is enslaved to it. He still bears the guilt of what he did to other people for it. And he never breaks free of that. Now, Tolkien says that at one point in the story, it all hinges on one point, because actually, under Frodo's leadership and compassion, we start to see the emergence of Smeagol, the old self of Gollum, you might say, the other side, the original self, who, while still enslaved, wants something more, is is a more delightful character, a nicer character indeed. And there is this kind of inner conflict represented by these two personalities between a desire to serve and love Frodo and a desire to serve and love the ring. Now, Tolkien points to a particular passage in which the moment of the possibility of redemption is taken away from Gollum forever. And let me find it again, because I think it's very much worth you hearing. This is the problem when you write so many illegible notes that when it comes to the stream, you're wondering where to look. But here we go. They're just camping outside of Minas Morgul. Gollum had disappeared for a while, and Frodo and Sam have decided to go to sleep. And so Gollum found them hours later, when he returned, crawling and creeping down the path out of the gloom ahead. Sam sat propped against the stone, his head dropping sideways and his breathing heavy. In his lap lay Frodo's head, drowned deep in sleep. Upon his white forehead lay one of Sam's brown hands, and the other lay softly upon his master's breast. Peace was in both their faces. Gollum looked at them. A strange expression passed over his lean, hungry face. The gleam faded from his eyes, and they went dim and grey, old and tired. A spasm of pain seemed to twist him, and he turned away, peering back up towards the pass, shaking his head as if engaged in some interior debate. Then he came back, and slowly putting out a trembling hand, very cautiously he touched Frodo's knee. But almost the touch was a caress. For a fleeting moment, could one of the sleepers have seen him, they would have thought that they beheld an old weary hobbit, shrunken by the years that had carried him far beyond his time, beyond friends and kin, and fields and streams of youth, an old starved, pitiable thing. But at that touch Frodo stirred and cried out softly in his sleep, and immediately Sam was wide awake. The first thing he saw was Gollum, pawing at his master, as he thought. "Hey, you," he said roughly. "What are you up to?" Nothing, said Gollum softly. "Nice, master." "I dare say," said Sam. "But where have you been to? Sneaking off and sneaking back, you old villain." Gollum withdrew himself, and a green glint flickered under his heavy lids. Almost spider-like he looked now, crouched back on his bent limbs with his protruding eyes. The fleeting moment had passed, beyond recalled. Sneaking, he hissed. "Hobbits always so polite, yes. Oh, nice hobbits. Smeagol brings them up secret ways that nobody else could find. Tired he is, thirsty he is, yes, thirsty. And he guides them and he searches for paths, and they say sneak, sneak. Very nice friends. Oh yes, my precious, very nice." This passage, we see a couple of things going on. The moment when Gollum is looking at the hobbits, at first there's a kind of interior debate, we're told, and there's a spasm of pain within him, and he looks up to the path that they're following. It's important to note, and there's a bit of foreshadowing here with some of the imagery, that Gollum is leading them into a trap. He plans to take them into the tunnels of Shelob's lair, Shelob being this giant spider, and he hopes that she will kill the two hobbits and leave him the ring of power. And so we can infer that Gollum is conflicted about taking them on this path. Part of him wants to do this because he wants the ring. The other part is cares for them, particularly Frodo. Indeed, we might think that he has a degree of sympathy He feels the suffering of Frodo and compassion for them. He wants to do him well. And so he caresses Frodo's knee. It's almost a loving caress of I infer, but you could read something, see something else in the passage, that he understands Frodo's anguish and torment and the quest that he's on, and that part of him feels deeply sorry for Frodo and wants to help him for both their sakes. But then Sam wakes up and is rather rude to him, treats him like a piece of trash, like a monster, a villain. And this utterly shatters that attitude. It almost allows the darker part, which wants the ring back, the part that wants revenge, to be emboldened, to be awakened, and to win out. Tolkien says this is the decisive moment. Sam's brusqueness, which isn't unwarranted. He just wants to protect Frodo from someone he believes is very dangerous. It's, as Ragplay says, I think this is a good way of putting it. He re-hardens his heart at Sam's accusation. He can't stand being confronted with his own reflection because he is sneaking and conniving. But at the same time, it destroys any possibility then of receiving atonement, right? He cannot find the redemption. He cannot find the will to be on the side of Frodo and Sam, of finding redemption from being enslaved by the ring. Tolkien discusses this in the letters, and he suggests that it could have been possible, right, that Gollum would have been somewhat redeemed, and that although he would still be lured by the ring at Mount Doom, Tolkien conjectures that if he had been repentant after this point, he would have known that he couldn't willingly throw the ring in, but he could throw himself in with the ring. So Gollum could have received redemption by willingly sacrificing himself with the ring to save Frodo, essentially. And he puts it in that way, to save Frodo. But he doesn't. This moment takes that away from him, and he is unredeemed, even though Frodo shows him great compassion. And both of these incidents, the one with Wormtongue, the one with Gollum, what we find is that they mirror the parable of the sower, or at least one of the things in the parable of the sower, another of Jesus' teachings. So let me bring that up, and this will kind of lead us towards the end. So let's see. Looking at the Gospel of Mark here, there are other versions, but this was a good one. Again, Jesus began to teach by the lake. The crowd that gathered around him was so large that he got into a boat and sat out in a lake, while all the people were along the shore at the water's edge. He taught them many things by parables, and in his teaching said, "Listen, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places, where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among the thorns, which grew up and choked the plants, so that they did not bear grain. Still other seed fell on good soil. It came up, grew, and produced a crop, some multiplying 30, some 60, some 100 times." And let me skip forward here to where Jesus explains the parable. The farmer sows the word, that is, the word of God, or the message of God. Some people are like seed along the path where the word is sown. As soon as they hear it, Satan comes and takes away the word that was sown in them. Others, like seed sown on rocky places, hear the word and at once receive it with joy. But since they have no root, they last only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. Still others, like seed sown among thorns, hear the word. But the worries of this life, the deceitfulness of wealth, and the desires for other things come in and choke the word, making it unfruitful. Others, like seed sown on good soil, hear the word and accept it, and produce a crop, some 30, some 60, some 100 times what was sown. I think it's reasonable to infer that both Gollum and Wormtongue are like individuals who receive the word, but as soon as they hear it, Satan comes along and takes away the word that was sown in them. Or like the seed which is immediately taken up by the birds along the rocky path. In Wormtongue's case, he receives this offer of mercy, but immediately Saruman takes it away by saying something which makes him feel incredibly guilty, stirs within him revenge, and leads to his ultimate demise. With Gollum, he's been shown this compassion by Frodo, and it awakens in him a sympathy and compassion which almost leads him to repentance. But Sam's words, harsh words, take that away from him, and he is lost forever. I think in that respect, then, Tolkien has a somewhat more pessimistic view of the power of compassion than does Wagner. Wagner seemed to suggest that if we show compassion to another, such as a Kundry or an Amfortas, they can be healed. They will be healed. All those who are shown compassion are healed within the opera. There could be characters like Klingsor the Wizard, who is destroyed, who maybe you could say are counterexamples, but he's never shown compassion, right? So I think that's important. All those who receive mercy attain salvation, the restoration of right relationships. Whereas in the Lord of the Rings, there are individuals who are unredeemable. They are condemned to evil, and even though they couldn't be pulled, like Gollum, who is nearly there, they are sorry individuals who, unfortunately, are just created as such. Not everybody can be saved, I guess is the point. And that's quite a powerful lesson, especially in our day and age, where it seems, if we go back to the very early in the conversation, we spoke about how Wagner, like many leftists in his earlier days, believed people were fundamentally good and corrupted by the system, the abuse of power, or the taking of power by the strong. And if we removed the political structure, if we overturned the chains of civilization, we could return to the wonderful state of nature where we exist in loving cooperation and harmony. And although he loses that utopianism, he still kind of believes that if we show compassion, we can save anybody. I think that's kind of there. With Tolkien, there's this suggestion that some people are just condemned. And maybe that's more true to life. That actually you can show somebody mercy and they still fall into terrible situations. They still are trapped. They still cannot get out. They cannot find redemption. It's a disturbing thought, somewhat horrifying. And I think that's actually why a lot of people find Calvinism in particular. I know Tolkien wasn't a Calvinist, but this logic is at the heart of predestination, right? God chooses before the beginning of the world some to be redeemed, to become his elect, some to be damned, and nobody can change that. But Tolkien in some ways cottoning on to at least the reality which that doctrine tries to capture, that there isn't universal salvation, and some people are just wicked or condemned to evil, and you have to recognize that. So that might be a fundamental distinction between Wagner and Tolkien too. That although they both emphasize mercy and pity, one has a much more optimistic view of how far that can save others. So let me just recap very briefly, maybe some of the key points in this conversation about Wagner and Tolkien. There's been a lot of discussion about how similar they are, how different they are, not least by Tolkien himself. We've seen that there's certain tropes which are unique to Wagner, which we don't find in the older mythologies, the Scandinavian Germanic mythologies. They are Wagner's original creation, the Rhine maidens as guardians of the gold, chased by Alberich, and the ring, Alberich's ring of power, which are taken over by Tolkien, or they're shared with Tolkien. As we move forward, we then drew on to the kind of philosophical comparisons. We looked at power and how in his socialist anarchistic days, Wagner would have seen power in itself as an evil, whereas Tolkien would have seen it as dangerous, but actually that there could be legitimate forms of power, such as divinely appointed kingship. We also saw that they shared a conviction that they shared a conviction that power. They shared a conviction that the victory over evil isn't indefinite, at least when it's achieved by human hands, right? Human political victory can only restrain evil for a short time. In reality, there will always be a plunging back into the darkness of suffering, exploitation, and death. Except where they differ on that point is that Tolkien believes the divine at the end of time will deliver a final reversal, right? So that God will intervene, Christ will return and overturn this suffering. Whereas Wagner doesn't have any such belief. And so all that there is the path to resignation. Finally, we looked at how both emphasize sympathy, compassion, and mercy, and these play a central role within the opera Parsifal and in the Lord of the Rings. And they are both critical to the idea of redemption. However, we looked at how, whereas for Wagner, compassion can offer redemption to all people, and indeed achieves redemption for all people, or at least for those characters who are offered it. For Tolkien, compassion doesn't necessarily end in salvation. Some people do not are not saved by the offer of compassion, such as Gollum and Wormtongue. And so I think that kind of summarizes what I've been saying. I'm going to have a look in the chat now and see what you guys have been saying, what you think about what I've said. If you have any questions or comments, anything that you feel I've missed or want to ask further, please put them in now, and I will address them when I get to them. I hope you've enjoyed it so far. I've found it really, it's quite stimulating putting them into conversation, I think, because it helps you to see ideas in both more clearly, and maybe some of the nuances in both. I guess one point I would I would maybe want to just sharpen on reflection is I kind of suggested Tolkien would be sympathetic to some of Wagner's concerns about power. But I think they're fundamentally different, right? Because Wagner says, Wagner says, Wagner presents power in itself as dangerous, right? It's not necessarily even for its corrupting quality, although it can have that upon us, that it draws us. It's this is it tempts us, it destroys human relationships, but fundamentally even the ascertaining of power is illegitimate, and that's why it's wrong. And we pursue it because we are corrupted, or it corrupts us. Whereas for Tolkien, it has that corrupting power. The power has the ability to corrupt us because we want it to exert our will upon the world. But it's not illegitimate from the beginning. Power is not always illegitimate. So that's a very key difference. They both agree it corrupts. They disagree that it's always evil. Yes, let's have a look at what people have been saying. And thank you to all of you for watching so far. It does really mean a lot to me. First, let me share the super chat for tonight. Odon D for £5. Great stream. Thank you. Well, thank you, Odon D, for watching. I really appreciate it. And I hope that you found this interesting and stimulating, and that it's made you think about Wagner and Tolkien in new ways. So, yes. I'll kind of skim through from the top. Good to see so many people. Vingle, Skadi Warrior, Evela's Sunglasses, Plotlines, Zviet FR, Crusader 21, God's Own Prototype. Good to see you all. Thank you for tuning in. Carwayne Calendar. Hello, my name is Kaiwan. I loved the Rings of Power show a little bit. I didn't think it looked like Xena the Warrior Princess, so I didn't kind of like that way. I'm a Republican. I feel like what is the... And it cuts off. I'm not sure where you were going with that, Kaiwan Calendar, but thank you for your comment. It's difficult to respond without knowing where you were going with it. But I've not seen the Rings of Power, and I don't intend to. I think, what would I say? I don't want it to get into a big debate about the Rings of Power, but what I would say is that if you're interested in real things which deal with fundamental human nature, with who we are, and open up all that we are, I would stick with the Ring cycle and with the Lord of the Rings. If you're looking at, if we're talking about all of these, in relation to the Rings of Power, because from what I understand, the Rings of Power is a TV series. I have a friend who says it's fun. There's a bit of adventure in it, some exciting action scenes, but it's not going to be something which stands the test of time as a masterpiece in terms of exploring, in terms of showing us deep truths about ourselves, which I think the Ring cycle and the Lord of the Rings gets closer to. That would just be my initial impression. I've not watched it. From what I've seen of the little bits I've seen, that's my impression. It's my impression from other people. But you might have a different opinion. So please share if you do think that. Biaki, good to see you. Valtra as well. This is great. Oh, Master Crafter, great to see you too. Interesting. So in the Ring cycle, he doesn't have that role. The great sword, Notung, is planted in the seed by Wotan, planted in a tree by Wotan, and only a mighty hero who it's meant for will draw it, and that is Siegmund, and it will give him victory in battle always. Although Wotan breaks his word on that for various reasons. The sword is broken, and it is reforged. Now Mime the dwarf, Alberic's brother, tries and tries and tries to reforge it for Siegfried, Siegmund's son, but fails, and only one who is heroic, of courage, without fear, can reforge the sword. So Siegfried himself remakes the sword and goes and slays Fafnir the dragon. So he's changed it a bit, but I think he's trying to draw out that this is a sword for the worthy, and it can only thus be made by somebody who's worthy. It's a recognition of that that reality. It has to manifest itself in the visible world of objects. And so a creature like Mime, who is spiteful, resentful, envious, scheming, he cannot make such a sword. Yes, this is yes. So very similar to Excalibur, as you say, but also this idea is also found within the ring cycle too. Vingal and Biaki had a good conversation about Norse mythology. I do appreciate that. The Enriab, good to see you. I suppose what makes Wagner and Tolkien so great is that they each capture a historical cultural moment in mythology. I think that's right. I think they also had the ability to draw out some of the latent themes within mythology, and so elevate it further. They were also able to combine it in new ways to draw out new perspectives. And they were both masters at their own genre. So like Tolkien does an amazing feat in creating this fantasy world, like unprecedented and unparalleled since, in terms of its depth, its detail. And it's not just the on the surface detail, it's how it connects in with the deeper values of the story too. Wagner, his musical achievements probably outshine Tolkien's literary achievement, insofar as he essentially remakes music in the process in very significant ways, and tells the story, the drama, on a musical and verbal and visual level. It's truly incredible what Wagner achieved in his artistic endeavors. I cannot wait to share with you guys how he used music in a dramatic way to reflect metaphysical realities. It's truly exceptional, imaginative, and something very, very special. And he's doing that in response to this mythological tale. He's translated. You might say he's translating, while at the same time having it performed on a stage. Just fantastic, as well. So there's a real depth to both of their greatness, and I think two very special individuals who we're very great. I'm very grateful that we have their works, and I fear that if we do not take precautionary measures, in 20 years' time, will we have these works anymore? If things keep going this way, are we going to lose access to performances of the ring cycle? Are we going to have re-edited versions of the Lord of the Rings published. Make sure you have your own physical copies, guys. I really believe that's important, not least for passing on to the next generation what is truly brilliant and beautiful in northwestern European cultures. Bjarki, Tolkien used more than just the Volsung Nibelung. Wagner used a one-trick saga pony, no offense. I think, though, you have to bear in mind that they're engaged in different projects. So Wagner's writing an opera. He cannot develop a whole fantasy world in the same way that a novel affords, right? And he's trying to tell a story about which reflects the deep truths about human nature, but also about the German people. And this was key to his ideas about what good art should do, that it should reveal things which have been hidden by modernity, the noble qualities of the Germanic peoples, or indeed any peoples, in relation to the art that's being made. So he wanted to choose a tale which he believed was pre-Christian and got to the heart of the Germanic spirit. And that was, in his view, represented by Germanic pagan mythology. So that's why he uses this. Now, he uses it in a creative way. He combines various characters and draws together different attributes in order to round them out, but also for narrative purposes. And I'm going to have Dr. Colin Cleary on Wagner Day. He's written a whole book about this and how Wagner actually is. Some people say, many people have the impression he distorted Norse mythology. Cleary argues he's actually one of the most faithful expositors of Norse mythology and Germanic mythology and philosophy. But nonetheless, and then what does Wagner do after this? He doesn't just carry on with kind of side stories of the Ring cycle. He writes Tristan and Isolde, or the Das Meistersingers, and finally Parsifal. So he moves on to different stories. So I think that's a little bit harsh on Wagner. If it was just on kind of fantasy stories, yes. But in terms of what he's trying to do, he's telling more stories in different settings, taking old tales and reworking them, than Tolkien, who's trying to build a body of legend in relation to one fantastical world. RCW, good to see you. Blair's no allegiance to his people. That bore him. Yes, I agree. I agree fully. Nullus ab no more courtesy. Sorry, I butchered your name. Good to see you. Let's see. Nico, hello. Thank you for commenting. I get Lord of the Rings and the Ring Cycle have a lot of themes in common. As far as works, they're very much in opposition. The Breaking of the Spear wouldn't be a good for Tolkien. That's revolution. I agree, and I don't know if you saw earlier in the stream, but I think I addressed this point. So I won't go into detail with it. But I think there's more commonalities than people give credit for, but there are important differences. I'd also say as well that it's important to remember that in the 19th and early 20th century, there was a whole raft of people who were opposed to modernity. They saw the rise of industrial capitalism as harming the cultural and social fabric. They thought it degraded human nature, that it treated men as mere machines, and thus robbed them of a meaningful life. They also, to varying degrees, thought that with this was a loss of um, the deep truths about us, the values which were important, which were upheld in medieval literature, for example. Hence the rise of kind of neo-medievalism amongst the pre-Raphaelites and various poets. And there was a real desire to what you might say a kind of some form of communal living which restored certain traditional relationships between people. Now, there was disagreement about the exact nature of that, as we've seen. But this anti-modernism is shared by Wagner and Tolkien, and it's shared by people like Bakunin, Carlyle, Ruskin, the Romantics, Marx to a certain degree. So you have all these people who today would be divided quite strongly on left and right. You have people who would support revolution and who wouldn't, but they agree that there's something deeply wrong with the materialistic exploitation of human beings for profit and the rise of what Tolkien would call robot culture. They share that, and they also share these other values I was talking about, the emphasis on compassion, of treating others as real beings and not just instruments of your will. So when we see them in that light, there's a bit more that they share than may seem to be. It may seem to be. There may seem to be on the surface. But I agree. Like, they wouldn't have seen eye to eye on all things, and they would have disagreed quite vehemently on several things. But there's important points of crossover, and in a way, that's where the fire lies, I think. Perhaps also that, and this is a point made by Cleary, perhaps they're both also responding to the mythology, that they both see a better way of life presented in these old tales, and than is present in the modern world, and they both see that in the vision of compassion that I've been trying to outline. Mastercrafter, by doing something good early on, mercy for Colin. Colin was there to do something good for the world, which is strange. Yes, it relies upon an idea that Tolkien never he doesn't kind of ram it in your face in the Lord of the Rings, but it is there if you're an attentive reader, that you've been kind of told beforehand to look for it. I should say that there is a providential power which is working things in the world to redemption, and it uses acts of mercy to do so, such as this. So it is a strange thing. It is counterintuitive, but if there's no kind of fate or providence or something like that directing it, then it would just be a happy coincidence. But in Tolkien's world, it is you could say a natural conclusion, and it demonstrates the benefit of mercy. And he would go on to say too, and I would agree with him, that actually acts of mercy in this world also have the same potential, because there is a divine order, there is a divine agent active in the world. Ragplay, is good to see you. Let's see. Perhaps he would have said that everybody had the it would have been possible for anybody to be redeemed, but the outcome seems to be that characters like Gollum and Wormtongue, when they're shown compassion, they do not find redemption. That's the point I was trying to make. So it may be possible in theory to redeem them, but in actuality, it becomes an impossibility because of what happens. They are sad states condemned to this. Yes. If Odin welcomed the burning of Valhalla, that's wishing for ultimate death. That's pure nihilism. For a nation to hold that idea as their myth is pure poison. Well, in the Ring Cycle, Wotan does welcome the burning of Valhalla, right? So this goes against the kind of revolutionary aspect that you were identifying earlier in the Ring Cycle. This is a much more Schopenhauerian interpretation coming through from Wagner. And I'm going to save it for Wagner Day because as you can already tell, this was originally going to be a 2-hour stream. We're already heading towards 3. So there's a lot that you can get into. Perhaps the fundamental issue is one of legitimacy rather than power. Power is absolute, but the acquisition of power for its own sake is a reflection of man's rejection of God. Yep, I agree with that. I think that's a good summary of the point. Well, I mean, this is essentially Nietzsche's criticism of Wagner, and again, I don't want to kind of get into it now because that's a deep debate about the issue of values. But you're right to identify, as Wagner does, that we are Wotan, and that we share Wotan's nature, the desire for power. Now, of course, Wagner might be wrong about his own tale, right? He doesn't have how he interprets the tale may not be its full meaning, and he might be wrong about some things. So, for example, or we might see more in it than he did. So, for example, Alberich takes the ring, the Rheingold, steals the Rheingold, forges it into a ring of power. This sounds like a bad thing in principle, but it pays for Valhalla, the fortress Valhalla, which is the basis of political order and the moral law. Are these things bad in themselves? An act of evil leads to good things. We might call it a happy fault, that unintentionally it's worked good in the world. So is there actually a necessity for something like a fall for the production of greatness? I leave that as an open question. Biaki, thank you. Yes, Gram. Gram is also another name of the sword. Yes, it is. Indeed. Agreed. Fully agreed with that. Siegfried is the quintessential Germanic hero. Do you think Bilbo is the quintessential? Well, he's much more quintessential English hero, isn't he? I feel like there's something there with him that corresponds well with the everyman Englishman. A bit of daring, a bit nervous, likes his comforts, but ends up being a rather noble character in the end. Thank you. Let's see. It's a portmanteau of abnormal and democracy. Abnormocracy. There we go. I got it. Abnormocracy. How do you get into basket making? Abnormal person asks. Well, if you look at the video that I made, if you're actually interested in basket making, this is not the channel for you. and I do not make baskets. That was a wee skit for an organization which enables people to meet up and then to, hang out and do things. If you go to that video, you'll find a link there where you can find more information. The socialist idea that political power is illegitimate is very like the idea of the evil stepmother. Socialists would kill her in revenge, while others would resist such a thing. I think you're right that it gets to the very heart of it, and you could connect it with the evil stepmother. I think it rests fundamentally on the false assumption that people are naturally good and that people in the state of nature are fundamentally equal and cooperative. Whereas I think one aspect of the right, which is not a great category, but let's just use it, the right, is that people can be evil. And there are dark elements in all of us. There is an Alberic in all of us. There is a Siegfried in all of us, perhaps. There is good and bad. But because people are prone to bad, because the lure of power corrupts us, right? We need to be ready to restrain. We need to be able to use force to restrain our darker impulses, or those individuals who give in to their darker impulses, for the good of everybody. And so this leads to the creation of a hierarchy, or the legitimization of a hierarchy, which and I don't know if you saw the coronation, but part of Charles's pledges, part of the obligations laid upon him, was that he would root out evil and uphold the good within the kingdom. So that's the justification for his power within the ceremony, beyond the divine mandate. He's been given that divine mandate to do that. So there is a recognition within that there is a place for force to be used to maintain order and peace and prosperity against in the recognition that human beings are not naturally always good, and we are self-interested, and we have flaws and are prone to them. I think that's not the only basis for hierarchy, right? There are others. You could say the great chain of being, and so on. The will to power might be another way, but this at least acknowledges this. This is a widespread view of why power is legitimate. But it also provides a context then for justice, right? So in this, as you say, Nico, the leftist response is the total overturning of anything which is illegitimate. This means the eradication of those people, and I emphasize that, those people who get in the way, those people who uphold the system. We saw that with the kulaks in Russia, right? They got identified by the regime as that which was stopping the communist revolution. So they all had to be shipped off to Siberia. In this case, as you say, the stepmother gets in the way, so she must be killed. Whereas in a system where justice is administered to uphold order, and then, okay, the evil stepmother does bad things. Well, she will be punished for it, right? Just as anybody else would, to restrain that evil from happening again. But she's not going to be killed for it, unless she, maybe she deserves it. So I think it gives a proper context for evaluating moral action within the context of restraining our vices. So I think it's a good analogy that you're drawing there, Nico. Yes, so I think that's all of our main comments today. Thank you again for tuning in. I've enjoyed this, and I've enjoyed interacting with you guys. You all know so much, and you've got great insights, and I really appreciate. I appreciate the opportunity to help bring that out. Um, if it means if this channel can be a platform for that kind of conversation, that's great, because we're getting into things which you're not gonna you don't find in our we don't really find in popular culture now. Um, but we're dealing with things which are super important. They get to the heart of what it means to live today. Um, we have a late comment here from Julius Flavius. A Roman hero killed his sister for mourning for the enemy who was her lover. Keep that woman in check. Uh, well, I'm not sure what Wagner would have. I don't think Wagner would have approved of that, or or Tolkien. Maybe that highlights the Romans had very different values than us. Maybe Nietzsche was more onto it, onto the Roman values than sometimes is thought. Anyway, thank you again. Let me remind you all that Wagner Day will be on the 27th of May. Let me double check that, because I feel like I've made a mistake before. Yes, Saturday the 27th of May. We're going to have lots of contributions. So far, we have on board, as I said, Dr. Colin Cleary, Dr. Alexander Jacobs, or Jacob, I should say. We're going to have contributions from John D, Panama Hat, Gifts Ungiven, Giant Geo, and many others. And there's going to be analysis, discussions like this. There's also going to be musical contributions and artistic contributions as well. So I think it'll be a real testament to Wagner. It's not going to be totally like praising him, but this stream has kind of delved into maybe some of the problems with his view in kind of Tolkien's responses and so on. But I think it'll be worthwhile, because he's such a huge figure in our culture that I found in my own life that I didn't know much about until I did my own research into him. He's one of the gifts and gems of German 19th century Germany. What he deals with, whether we agree with him or not, is worth engaging with, because it causes us to think about our own values, what we think is important, and how we should move forward. And I appreciate that in him. So yes, come in and tune in for that. Beyond that, you know what? Because we've been going on so long, we're about to hit 3 hours. I want to just play a little bit more from Parsifal, which I played earlier, because it's so good. It's so good. I want you to hear how good this is. While we're wrapping up, so we heard earlier Devund, and he's singing along here.
Nein, nicht die Wunde ist es. Ihr Blut, ich ströme dahin. Wir den Herz der Brand, das Sehnen, das unwahre Sehnen, das alle Sehnen wir macht uns sehen. Oh, Vater Liebe, wie alle Schauer liegt und zu. In den Gängen London.
Currently, Nietzscheans are reeing in the audience, I can imagine. The condemnation of desire, how dare he? Condemnation of will, how dare he? Let me just pause it so we don't get copyright strike. Just brings a smile to my face.
Nur hier im Herzen will ich wohl nicht weichen. Des Neulands Klage vernehm ich, die Klagen, ach, die Klagen, doch entweihte heilig Und ich, der Tor erfeige, so willen Klagen, floh ich hin.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for indulging me. I hope that you have a wonderful night, whoever you are, wherever you are. Thank you again for tuning in, and God bless you all.